people have different ways of responding to stress, right? Some people, when they experience a stressful situation, will kind of shut down and they just get very, very quiet and don't know what to say. But some people, when they get into a stressful situation, they just cannot stop talking, right? There's like this maybe a part of their brain shuts down, but that little hamster wheel that's really nervous at the back of their brain, it gets spinning and there's no filter between the brain and the mouth. And they start talking. Some people are like that, right? Maybe that's not really me. Maybe that's you. I don't know. But some people can't stop talking. I remember once I had this boss when I was a kid, and I was working at this little Italian restaurant, and all of a sudden, like the weather really picked up in central Illinois, and we're looking outside the windows, and it was one of those storms where you just like see it brewing on the horizon, right? And the sky goes from like daytime to like dark purple to like this nauseous green color, and you're looking at that, and it doesn't look good. And she just kind of lost it. She was looking outside and saying, we got to find a place to take cover, but there was no cellar or anything like that, right? There's no customers at that point. Everybody's at home taking shelter. And I remember she just starts talking, and she said, all right, well, there's this restaurant, and we're looking at the sky, and she says, okay, if there's a tornado, what we got to do? We got to hide all of the knives, because we don't want the knives like flying around in here if the tornado hits, right? And thanks be to God, no tornado hit us, and we got back to slinging spaghetti and everything a little while later. But some people just can't stop talking in stress. And here's a story, which is the Transfiguration. Here's Peter, and he encounters this moment on the mountain, and he just can't stop talking. He doesn't know what to say, Luke tells us very lovingly. And maybe that was part of what Peter had in mind. I mean, he just didn't know what to say. But I think we want to take in a lesson from this story. And we're coming up on Lent, which begins on Wednesday with Ash Wednesday. And we want to learn to keep silence before Jesus. Sometimes we just got to do that. Just kind of stop and keep silence before Jesus. Now, Peter didn't know what was going on, right? Him and James and John, Jesus called them up on the mountain with him. Peter had been with Jesus as kind of his chosen disciple. Earlier in this passage, chapter 9 of Luke, Jesus says, on this rock, I'm going to build my church. That rock is Peter. So Jesus has great plans for Peter. But Peter is in formation. Now, I know sometimes there's this like little stories we tell about, those bumbling disciples. I love the disciples, right? They are the apostles. They got chosen by Jesus. Jesus knew his business. These are folks that bravely went on to bring the church to the whole world, really. Like they laid the seeds for that. They lost their lives for their love of Jesus. And Peter, this fisherman from Galilee, he ends up in Rome, right? The head of this church that's growing by leaps and bounds. Well, here at this moment, he's just Peter trying to figure stuff out. And he goes up the mountain with Jesus, and Jesus is praying. And while Jesus is praying, it says that his face is transfigured. Now, let me line this up for you a little bit. We got to remember mountaintop experiences at different points in the scriptures, because mountains play really heavily into the biblical experience, right? You think about the prophets talking about like mountains and valleys and like the pathway, the way of the Lord that he's forming. Sometimes mountains are kind of seen as threatening in that sense, but often mountains are a place where people encounter God. And that's because back when God sent Moses into Egypt, and Moses brought the people of Israel out of Egypt. They go through the desert toward a mountain, Mount Sinai, right? And it's on Mount Sinai that the cloud of God's presence descends, and that is where Moses receives the Ten Commandments and receives, all these instructions on how sacrifice and worship are supposed to happen, the unfolding of the Ten Commandments that are the law. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago a little bit, but that mountaintop, Mount Sinai, is kind of like the primordial mountaintop that's influencing this story. There Moses goes up, meets God in the cloud. He comes down, and his face shines so much that they actually put like a covering over his face because they couldn't bear to look at Moses. And then, that cloud was representative of God's presence. Well, here's Jesus kind of replaying that same script, but he changes it a little bit. He goes up on the mountaintop. He's like this new Moses. He's already given the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. He's kind of given something like these, you could call them new laws, but this is the law of love. And he brings up the people of God, Peter, James, and John, just like Moses had brought Joshua with him and then gone down to talk to the people of God. But here is Jesus. It's a little different take on that script. It's not that he's reflecting the glory of God. It's that the glory of God is shining through him. They are seeing who Jesus is. It's a glimpse of the world to come. It's a glimpse of the wholeness of Jesus' nature. He is like this portable glory of God. He doesn't need a veil because his flesh is veiling the glory of God that is coming through. And in that moment, they see him. And who appears with Jesus? Moses, representative of the law, representative of that time when they went up Mount Sinai, and Elijah. And Elijah also has this mountaintop encounter with God. For Elijah, it's on Mount Horeb, where God appears to him. And Elijah, usually people say Moses, representative of the law, Elijah as representative of the prophets. It's kind of the whole of the Old Testament here pointing towards Jesus. And there's that moment then where Peter says, he starts talking. He says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And I love it in the NIV, if you follow this in verse 32, in the NIV, it says, it's Luke's little edition. And I think it's a loving edition, right? Because I think Luke, he loves Peter, right? He says, he did not know what he was saying, right? He didn't know what he was talking about, right? Let him off the hook a little bit. He was having this encounter. And what were those little shelters for, right? Well, we'll come back to that, but maybe part of it is like this Feast of the Tabernacles, right? Where they would go and build these shelters to remember the time when they tabernacled in the wilderness. Maybe it was kind of like the idea of the tabernacle itself, where the presence of God would come and meet God's people. That was where they worship. The tabernacle, kind of gets moved into the temple in Jerusalem later on. But that's the wrong idea. It is an idea. It's not all bad, but that is not what he had to be doing at that moment. They didn't need to build tabernacles. They had to be paying attention to Jesus. They had to keep quiet. And here they are, the experience. We can't imagine it, right? Like this encounter. And, maybe you've had some of those precious mountaintop encounters with God in your life, right? I think most of us have. Sometimes they're hard to define, right? They're hard to kind of like pin down because God is subtle. God works through creation and through our expectations. But this is kind of like the mother of all those sorts of encounters. It just blows the disciples away. I think that's part of why Peter couldn't talk. You see in the scriptures, whenever an angel appears or some presence of God, like the burning bush to Moses or something, it just often knocks people down, literally. Like they'll be flat on the ground. But in this case, Peter just didn't know what to do. He just starts talking and it makes no sense. He wants to kind of get to work, do something. In icons of this scene, which are like little holy depictions of something from the scriptures, and icons of this scene. If you look this up, and I would have loved to show you a picture on the projector, but we're working on that. But in icons in this scene, they're like falling down. One of them is always like holding his throat, like he's about to sick up. It's kind of just this radiant presence of God, and it's just kind of knocking back all their categories, and they're falling down in front of them. And then, but you see this moment. Peter's saying it's good for us to be here, but keep in mind, this isn't the end of Peter's story. Peter comes back to the Transfiguration in his second letter. So if you want to look at that at home, 2 Peter 1, 16 and 18, Peter talks about this. He's an eyewitness to this, and he talks about how they heard the voice of God. He's like, we didn't make all this stuff up. We had this encounter with the living Son of God. We heard God's voice, and that is, part of the foundation of what gives him the confidence to go and preach the gospel to all nations, right? It's a pivotal moment for Peter. So he later does figure it out. But verse 33, notice this. It says, as they were leaving, Master, it's good for us to be here, all that. I didn't know what he was saying. They should have been keeping silence. And a little bit later, they will keep silence. Verse 36, the disciples kept this to themselves, and they told no one at that time what they had seen, right? And I think about this in our moment, right? This idea that we got to learn to keep silence before Jesus. I think about this because, we can distract ourselves with so much noise, right? So much of our society is kind of this white noise maker, right? And we lull ourselves with noise. And it's all the obvious stuff. I mean, it's TV, and it's the earbuds, and it's the radio, and it's the face in the phone, right? And, I dare you to sit quietly without pulling your phone out when you are in a public place. I mean, it's almost like the other day I was sitting there somewhere, and I was like, I almost feel embarrassed if I don't pull my phone out. Sort of like, don't you have anything to be doing, right? It's like, I dare you to do that, to sit quietly without pulling out your phone. I mean, we are so acclimated to noise. And we're always at risk of becoming part of that noise and contributing to that noise. I don't know. I mean, it's a noisy world. I remember once I was visiting one of our dear elders who has since passed on to glory, and he couldn't hear so well. So I was kind of raising my voice and talking really loud to him. How are you doing? Fine. Well, I'm so glad to see you, doing one of those. Well, so I go home and I walk in the door and I see Lisi. I'm like, so what's for lunch, right? She's like, okay. We do that, right? We soak that up from our environment, and we can start to contribute to that noise kind of unconsciously, just become part of the cloud of noise. And we get so that we can't hear. And look at verse 35. A voice came from the cloud, right? Can we hear that voice? The voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. Here's the thing. We need silence to hear. If we can't keep quiet, we can't hear the voice. We can't hear God. Silence is actually an act of holiness. And in fact, you can't have one without the other. You can't have holiness if you can't learn to practice silence. And there's silence in heaven. For those of you who are introverts like me, there's silence in heaven. Check it out, Revelation chapter 8, verse 1. The seventh seal, the Lamb breaks it, and there is silence for half an hour. And this year we're calling it the year of refuge. And I think silence is really a kind of refuge that our spirits need in this world that can't stop talking. And they practice that. Verse 36, right? They practice some silence. We've got to learn to keep silence before Jesus. And we see these disciples. We see, what they did, what their experience was. But let me tell you why I think we've got to learn to keep silence before Jesus. So I think the first reason is because of humility. We've got to practice silence because of humility. It's silence when we don't know. This is Peter all the way, right? And what I love about Peter is that I think he is such a humble guy, right? I mean, that's both his humble origins, but he just always keeps putting himself out there, right? He's like Peter, that's like, if it's you, Lord, let me walk to you on the waters. I mean, Peter's the one who in verse, a little bit earlier than this, when Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Peter's the one that answers, right? He just keeps putting himself out there. He's got that humility of like, well, I don't know, but how about this, right? He just keeps going to Jesus. But we got to have silence as an act of humility when we don't know. And Luke says he did not know what he was saying. Right? It's a good thing. If you don't know, just practice silence, right? This is Abe Lincoln's famous quote, right? It's kind of a quality in life. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and to remove all doubt. Have any of you ever heard that before? Yeah. So it's not a bad quality just in general, but I think it's a spiritual quality too, right? When we don't know, we just got to keep silent. It can help us when we're with other people. Silence is kind of the first act of empathy, right? Learning to listen. Why does somebody think the way they do? Why are they saying that, right? Sometimes we've got to speak up. Sometimes we've got to speak out, because if we don't, it can be the occasion for a grave injustice, or we can be inadvertently letting something stand that is deeply hurtful to another person. There's always that risk. It's that kind of that feeling that you have, and it is, for me, a really terrible feeling of regret. Like, I should have said something, right? That moment. You ever felt that? Like, why didn't I say something? So sometimes we got to talk. My tendency is always to kind of like wait a little bit to kind of think about it, because usually when I speak too quickly, I make a mistake. So I like to wait. That's kind of like to the frustrations of my sons, because sometimes they're like wanting to buy something, for instance, on Black Friday, right? There's those, the specials that lead up to the day right after Thanksgiving where they want to get you to buy something. And they're like, hey, I want to get this thing. And I'm like, well, why don't you just wait a little bit? And then you go back to the computer and like all sold out. So, whoops. So sometimes you got to jump in, right? You got to just make your decision and go with it. But I think sometimes it's better to kind of just wait, be silent, make a comment kind of on the other side of things. And I think also, it can help us when we're talking to people, but it can also be a humility and an empathy toward ourselves, right? We got to have some patience toward ourselves. A philosopher and poet, a guy named Rainer Maria Rilke, he was German. He said, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. I think what he means is there's going to be loose ends in our lives, right? Loose ends. Do you ever have any loose ends, right, in your life? Things that you don't have figured out, pieces that you need to deal with. And I honestly, I hate loose ends, right? Loose ends are kind of like my kryptonite. I guess one of the lessons of parenting that you learn is that you're just going to have to live with loose ends, right? Things that are undone, the stuff that just doesn't get done. It's like the dishes didn't all get washed. The toys didn't all get picked up. There is that one toilet that we just need to clean if we can squeeze it in before we run to the doctor's appointment, right? There's just loose ends. But that's our lives. Right? Loose ends inside of us, these places that, like Rainer Maria Rilke says, are unsolved. Places where we don't have it all figured out, where we aren't all put together, where we got some things that maybe are kind of frayed, and that's where we have to have some patience to kind of be silent. Get this, be silent before the mystery of ourselves, right? And the mystery of what Jesus is doing within us. Sometimes we will not get that. We'll think, I know what he's doing. He's teaching me, I don't know what, right? I've heard several people say this year, he's teaching me patience. I think that's good, right? But sometimes we don't know. We don't have a clear sense of what are you doing in here, Jesus? Right? Just be silent before that mystery. And it's true that, sometimes it's a human tendency. We give ourselves a pass, right? We let ourselves off easy. We hold others to account. But sometimes we do the opposite. We're just really tough on ourselves. And I think sometimes rather than beating ourselves up, we got to just sit silently. And if you're not sure how you're feeling, just kind of sit with it. And if you're not sure what Jesus is doing, just kind of wait and listen. Just have that humility. When you don't know, just wait and be silent. Have the humility to believe that Jesus might be doing and saying something that you're not getting yet. But it is something, right? It's Philippians 1:6. I know that the one who began a good work in you will bring it to completion by the day of the Lord. He's doing that work. Have that humility. I think a second piece is that we need silence to listen to Jesus, to do the work of discernment. The voice from the cloud says, "This is my son, listen to him." Right? You can't hear him, can't listen if you're not silent. Paul talks about this later. He says, we walk by faith and not by sight. And I think we just got to admit that a lot of times we do not see. We don't know where we're going. It's those moments where we need guidance from Jesus, and we got to do the work of listening, discernment. I mean, Peter and James and John, what did they think was going to happen? Jesus just said to them, come up this mountain with me, or they were, we know James and John at one point were kind of like, hey, they got their mom involved. Can one of us sit at your right hand and one at your left hand when you enter into your kingdom? They're probably pleased to be going with Jesus as like his chosen three, these top disciples, but they didn't know what was going on. Here they go up the mountain. What's going to happen? And then they're kind of blown away by this experience. But I think a lot of times we're not going to know what's going on. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but we're not going to know what's going on. We don't know. And that's the moment where we got to listen, right? Take seriously that this is my son, my beloved. Listen to him. We don't know. I remember one time I had this big decision to make, and I made it. And then I was talking to an elder somebody I respected in our church, and he said, "How did you know?" And I was like, "No, I don't know anything. I do not know a single thing, but this is what I feel that I'm supposed to do," right? Like, how did you know? Often we just don't know. How do you discern? How do you get Jesus' guidance? How do you listen to him? For me, a good rule of thumb, and there's a lot we could say about this, but a good rule of thumb is to think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says, there's all these different gifts, but the ones that abide are faith, these? Faith, hope, and love, right? So when you're discerning, when you're in a place of doubt, think about this, and this is kind of what some of the great saints of the church teach over the ages, especially somebody named Ignatius of Loyola. When you're in doubt, think about this. Does what I'm doing or what I'm thinking about or what I'm pondering or what I'm choosing, does it lead to greater faith? Right? Does it help me to have greater faith in God, greater trust in God? Do I believe in him and what he's doing? Does it lead to greater faith? Does it lead to greater hope for myself? A hopeful vision of the future, a hopeful vision for others that I'm responsible for and to? And does it lead to greater love in my life? A love for those around me, greater love for God, whatever that is, for my community, for my church, for my nation, whatever that is, does it lead to greater love? Faith, hope, and love. That's one way to kind of hear the voice of Jesus in the quiet and listen to him, right? And I think, even that's a rule of thumb. That's a sketch of some ideas of how you can kind of get at discernment, because we got to be honest. Being a disciple of Jesus, it's going to be like these three disciples. We're not going to know. That's kind of part of what it means to be a disciple. It's wrapped up in the very experience. They go up the mountain with Jesus. They don't know what they're getting into. They don't know what they're seeing. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. We just aren't going to know. And there's going to be those moments like that hymn, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," where we cannot see, when we don't exactly know how to hear, but we take his nail-marked hand and we just keep moving through the cloud. A guy named Mark Thibodeau, he says this, "Walk with Jesus, the companion, into the unknown darkness that is discipleship." I love that the discipleship itself is this unknown darkness. That is the nature of discipleship, is to move into the unknown. It's like Paul in Romans. He says, "Look, God is glorious, but who can know the mind of the Lord? Who can be his counselor?" And the answer, which is unspoken, is nobody, right? We can't know. Not really. We can have a sense of an idea. We can do good discernment and have an idea of what we're called to in a place, what we're called to among a people, what we're called to do in a certain time. But in reality, none of us knows the impact of our actions until the last day. That is when all those things will be revealed. And I suspect that if we're walking closely with Jesus into that darkness, we will be surprised by the way that his grace has flowed through us, the way that he has impacted others in the world through us. We won't know those things. I think a lot of times stuff that I've felt deeply committed about and things that I've felt like, I got to do this, I got to be here in this place with these people, it never turns out the way I think it's going to. Not saying it turns out bad, but I just often don't understand the full extent of it. And that's discipleship. You just keep walking in this darkness even though you don't know all that Jesus is doing in and through and around you. So I think what we're doing, we're getting into this practice of silence before Jesus so that we can be ready to listen to him, to hear his guidance. I don't want us to get confused about this, right? Listening to Jesus, every once in a while, people across history, and maybe you've had this experience, will say, "Man, I heard the voice of God on something," right? Every once in a while, people will say that. But most of the time, it doesn't quite work like that. As Dallas Willard put it, he said, "Many cannot progress in their relationship with God because they focus solely on what they think God might be telling them to do." You see, there are places in the scriptures where, as God's people, we are called servants of God. Paul calls himself a servant of God. But Jesus himself really redefined that whole relationship in John chapter 15 when he said, "I no longer call you servants, but friends. Because servants don't know what the master is doing, but I have told you my plans." And so here is this vision of friendship with God. What Paul calls in 1 Corinthians co-laborers with God. Those who are moving with God through life. It's not, we got to get out of this kind of like image of like God speaks, we hear, we do. It's not like that, right? It's this back and forth. It's this walking with friendship in the darkness often with the God who loves us. God speaks, we speak. There's this call and response. And so I think we got to kind of move away from that kind of image that listening is just kind of like waiting for some order to come down on high. It's this relationship. So God's always calling us to. It's why Jesus brought Peter, James, and John up the mountain rather than just yelling down some kind of order from the top of the mountain, right? He wants us with him. So we got to have that silence so that we can do the work of discernment. Listen to him. I think there's a third thing. We got to be silent to enter the cloud, which means we got to do the cloud work of prayer. So we got to have humility, discernment, prayer. It's too easy to contribute to the noise. Sometimes by talking too much, sometimes by talking too loud, sometimes by just refusing to stop talking. But we can also contribute to the kind of general noise around us by doing the wrong thing, right? So the Peter, James, and John, they get this idea. Peter's the ringleader. He says, let's build these shelters, these little tabernacles or something like that. This idea to kind of like, like commemorate or make them safe or like, hearken back to the wilderness wanderings or who knows what. Let's build these tabernacles, right? Build a shelter. Seems like a good idea, right? We'll build Jesus and Elijah and Moses' little house up here. But that's not what they're supposed to be doing, right? It seems like good work, seems harmless, but it's just not what they're supposed to be doing, right? They're not going to mess up God's grand plan, but it's not their work right then. I think sometimes we got to know what our actual work is. Like do the work God calls us to. Do your work. Do the actual work. Sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes it's just like, there it is. Do the work. But often we kind of get looped into these like A, B sorts of situations, right? Like these dichotomies, these bifurcations. You see, like it's either this or this. I've got to go do a thing. But sometimes we've got to practice silence and to do the work of prayer so we can see that something else is happening in front of us. We got to kind of find our way through the cloud. I mean, remember, they go up on the mountain. Verse 29, this is so key. Jesus is the one taking the lead here. As he was, what's that next word? As he was praying. This is a prayer story. This is about prayer. And when they come back down, they meet this father who has a son who's possessed by a demon. And Jesus, the other disciples couldn't cast it out. Why couldn't they? Jesus says this one comes out through prayer and fasting. So it's a prayer story. It's wrapped in prayer. And that cloud, I think, is kind of an image of prayer. The cloud, back in the scriptures, the cloud was on the mountain with Moses. That was the presence of God. Moses talks to God in the cloud. Or Moses meets God at the tent of meeting. You'd go to the edge of the Israelite camp, go into this tent. Joshua would go with him. God comes down as a cloud, right? And you would talk to God as with a friend, we read in the scriptures. The cloud leads the people in the desert, right? Cloud by day, fire by night. When Jesus ascends to heaven at the end of the Gospel of Luke, he is hidden by a cloud, right? The cloud is this powerful symbol of God's mysterious presence. And so we got to enter into the cloud. It's this image of coming to God, coming to God's presence is prayer. And the disciples, they just had to kind of wait in that cloud. They start talking, but they didn't know what they were saying. They start doing, but they're not doing the right work. What they had to do was be silent. They had to do the cloud work of prayer. Gordon Cosby, this gentleman who passed away a number of years ago, but was kind of a saintly figure, he founded a church called the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. And Gordon Cosby said this: "We tend to move much too quickly to doing. I think we need to spend much more time being with Jesus, deeply entering into relationship with Jesus and letting him shape and form us. If we do that, the doing will become clear." And folks, this is why our mission together as the church has always, and especially in this last year, it's been always undergirded by prayer, right? We're doing prayer labs, and we call them labs because we say we don't know what's going to happen. We just are showing up. We've had prayer meetings. We've had home prayer. Last year, we called the whole year the year of prayer. There's this sense, live sense, that everything we do, it's got to emerge from prayer. It's got to be held by prayer. It's got to move toward God in prayer. It's the cloud work of prayer. So I think we got to do that before we start trying to fix stuff, before we start trying to build the tabernacles, whatever it is, do the cloud work of prayer. Before we start talking, before we start, coming up with all these schemes, do the cloud work of prayer. So here we are with Jesus, this image coming up the mountain. We need to be silent before him to practice humility. We got to be silent to do the work of discernment, and we got to be silent so that we can do the cloud work of prayer with him. This is Transfiguration, this word, this Sunday that gets us right up to the border of Lent. And Transfiguration, part of the meaning of it is that it's this glimpse of the world to come. Right? It's a world where God is all in all. This world where there will be silence in heaven. This world where we can fall on our knees and say nothing, right? It's this world where we come before Jesus. I think about that one song, right? Like, I can only imagine, right? It's kind of a heart-wrencher, that song, I can only imagine. What do we do when we come into the presence of Jesus, both on that last day when we see him face to face, like Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians, but then also in those moments where we have a glimpse of Jesus in our lives? Well, I can only imagine what we'll do. And Transfiguration is a glimpse of that world to come. Look at verse 32. Jesus was praying. Peter and his companions were very sleepy. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing there. So that's it right there. Are we fully awake? Right? Are we attentive to the glory of God, the transfigurative moments that are happening right in front of us? Are we seeing God in all things? Are we listening to him? It turns out that silence is kind of the audible version of being present and awake. And then here they see, there's this visual version too. They're seeing Jesus, right? Are we fully awake to all that God's doing? That's part of what the Transfiguration is telling us. I just saw this movie. One of our sons recommended to us called Free Guy. It's kind of a funny movie. I won't spoil it for you. But Free Guy, there's part of the premise of the movie, it comes down to this. I won't tell you how it ends or whatever, but the premise of the movie is this. Are we shuffling through life like bots in a video game? Or are we awake to the possibilities for living truly and deeply that are all around us? Now, in the movie, that whole other way of life is symbolized by this paradise that's kind of hidden just beyond the horizons. But I think that's what the Transfiguration is doing for us too. Right? There's this vision, it's there. You can just kind of catch a glimpse of it. Are we fully awake to be able to see the glory of God? Are we silent so we can hear him? Brothers and sisters, as we prepare to enter into this season of Lent, it starts this Wednesday, hope you'll be there at 7 p.m. As we prepare to enter this season of Lent, I pray that we can learn the art of practicing silence before the one who is good and who is loving and who is calling us up on the mountain to see his glory with him.